Good morning to everyone. We will be starting shortly. Good morning, everyone, and let's get started. And thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on the 2030 Census: Obligations, Obstacles, and Opportunities. This briefing is being put together jointly by the Leadership Conference Education Fund, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Census Counts, and the Census Project. We are recording this webinar today, and we will be sharing the recording with participants after the call. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our speakers. We will be answering questions only during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Please do limit your questions to topics pertinent to the discussion and refrain from posting multiple questions at a time so that we can take as many questions as possible. We do have live transcription available for this meeting. Use the live transcript button in the menu at the bottom of your screen to enable or disable. With all of that started, I am Meeta Anand. I'm the Senior Director for Census and Data Equity at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. I am more than thrilled to introduce all of our speakers for today. Arturo Vargas, who is the Senior Advisor to NALEO Educational Fund. He served 30 years as its CEO and has been an advocate for a fair and accurate census since the 1990 decennial, and has served on several advisory committees to the U.S. Census Bureau, and was most recently the chair of the short-lived 2030 Census Advisory Committee. Thomas A. Saenz has been president and general counsel of MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, for 16 years. He has litigated census-related issues in the past, and he is a former lead representative of MALDEF as an institutional member of the Census Bureau National Advisory Committee, the NAC. Steve Jost has twice served at the Census Bureau, overseeing the outreach and advertising campaigns to promote cooperation with the 2000 and 2010 decennial counts. Since then, he serves as a consultant to the Census Project and manages public outreach campaigns at AVOC, a Washington, D.C. public relations firm. And last and certainly not least is Terry Ann Lowenthal, a former staff director of the U.S. House Census and Federal Statistical System Oversight Subcommittee, and now advises several nonprofits, business associations, cities, and philanthropy on census policy and operational issues, including ourselves. We are really, really thrilled that they are able to join us for this briefing today. We hope that everyone respects the nonpartisan nature of this conversation. And I will just review the agenda and we will turn it over to Arturo for his remarks. So we are going to be starting with an introduction to the decennial census planning cycle. We will be discussing the legal foundations for the decennial census. And then we will be talking through appropriations, where we are and where we should be. And finally, talking through the operations cycle. And then we will have, as I said, the Q&A portion at the end. We expect to have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A, so please do include your questions in the Q&A box. I will also know in the Q&A portion, we will have several other experts available to answer questions, so we should be able to have a robust discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Arturo. Arturo, over to you.
Thank you, Mita. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today on the status of the 2030 decennial census. The purpose of this session is to provide interested parties and members of the press with an overview of what the Constitution and other federal laws require in carrying out the census and who bears that responsibility. What is required to conduct such an undertaking, where we should be in the planning cycle for 2030, and to identify emerging concerns. As my colleagues on this call will explain, conducting a decennial census takes more than a decade to plan. In fact, planning for 2030 began more than 10 years ago already. It is not an operation that can be carried out from one moment to the next. It is a costly endeavor, and the Bureau is constantly exploring ways to minimize its cost. And it is the largest mobilization that the federal government carries out, second only to going to war. Given the significant challenges and shortcomings of the 2020 census, a growing network of stakeholder organizations, philanthropic groups, and researchers has been closely following the preparations for the 2030 census. Our goal is to help the Census Bureau conduct a successful decennial, which is now in less than 4 years. We are determined to do what we can to ensure that the historic 2020 undercount of several segments of the U.S. population, including very young children, African Americans, Latinos, American Indians, certain Asian Pacific Islander communities, rural communities, and low-income households, is not repeated or made worse in 2030. To do so, we need to engage the Census Bureau in a formal and transparent fashion. The 2030 census is almost upon us, and Congress must fulfill its legal obligations to ensure it is carried out successfully. With new strategies being contemplated and tested for 2030, the Census Bureau needs to ensure transparency and engagement with stakeholders to promote a more accurate census than 2020. Unfortunately, some of the most effective vehicles for the public and for stakeholders to interact with the Census Bureau and provide expert feedback no longer exist. On March 4th, the Secretary of Commerce announced that the Scientific Census Advisory Committee, the National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Population Groups, and the 2030 Census Advisory Committee were all abruptly and inexplicably terminated as of February 28th. I was asked to chair the 2030 Census Advisory Committee, and before the committee was eliminated, we were preparing for the committee's 4th meeting and the first in 2025. Among the topics we were to discuss were to provide recommendations last April to the Census Bureau was on its plans to change the way that group quarters are enumerated. Now, group quarters include such places as college residence halls, residential treatment centers, skilled nursing facilities, and the like. The Bureau is planning to make greater use of the online response option in counting residents in group quarters, a significant change from prior decennials. Late last year, the 2030 Census Advisory Committee delved into one of the major challenges the Census Bureau faces in achieving an accurate count, the historic and growing undercount of very young children. The Bureau had approved an advisory committee working group on this issue to address the crisis. That work now has been halted. With the demise of the 2030 Census Advisory Committee and the other 2 committees, the Bureau is proceeding with these plans without the input from the public. Ironically, the Secretary of Commerce's excuse for terminating the advisory committees was because, according to him, the purpose for which the committees were established, to provide input on the plans for the 2030 census, had been fulfilled. As we will explore over the next several minutes, the opposite is true. Fortunately, the Scientific Census Advisory Committee has been able to continue its work independently of the Census Bureau, with the support of one of our stakeholder organizations, the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force, a nonpartisan network of historians, data scientists, legal experts, and others who support the Census Bureau's work to maintain and improve the accuracy of public data. Nonetheless, the Census Bureau must establish new and effective avenues for public and expert feedback into its 2030 plans, or risks a census design that may fail. There are other particular milestones that the Bureau should be hitting as we approach 2030, including developing and releasing a 2030 operational plan, conducting research and tests on proposed changes to the enumeration strategies, carrying out essential preparations in collaboration with local governments, including LUCA, local updated census addresses. These are the elements that should be occupying the attention of Congress and the administration. We need our policy leaders to focus on getting the 2030 census right, instead of spending precious time and resources on distractions, such as calling for an illegal mid-decade census, or falling gravely short of the constitutional requirement to count all persons living in the United States, specifically for the purpose of reapportioning the U.S. House of Representatives. My colleague Tom Sines will now provide the constitutional and legal framework that governs the census. Thomas.
Thank you, Arturo. The census is actually in our U.S. Constitution and has been there from the very beginning. While the census, because of the utility of the data that is provided, is used for many things, including appropriations by the Congress, numerous applications by states and local governments, and use by the private sector, there are only two constitutionally derived purposes of the U.S. Census. The first is to reapportion the seats in the House of Representatives. That's explicitly in the Census Clause in Article 1 as modified by the 14th Amendment. That means we conduct the census constitutionally solely to ensure that states are represented in the House of Representatives commensurate with their numbers. The other constitutional purpose, though not explicit in the Constitution itself, but derived by the U.S. Supreme Court, is to ensure that districts, political electoral districts within states, are equalized based on population differences over the course of a decade. This is a result of cases in the 1960s from the U.S. Supreme Court announcing the one person, one vote doctrine, which basically requires, after every decennial census, that all districts that have been drawn for Congress, for state legislatures, for local bodies that have districted representatives must be redrawn to better reflect the new population as determined by the census. As Arturo has mentioned, the Census Clause in the Constitution, as modified by the 14th Amendment, requires an enumeration of all persons. That's all that it says, persons. Therefore, any attempt to extract, leave out, never count particular populations are unconstitutional. That means that any mid-decade redistricting that attempts to leave out certain populations, whether that's the undocumented from the apportionment count or other non-citizens from the count used for redistricting, those are unconstitutional purposes, rendering a mid-decade census that attempts to accomplish those things unconstitutional in two respects. The first respect, of course, is that the Constitution contemplates a census every 10 years. It specifically requires a census every 10 years. It does not contemplate a president deciding or Congress deciding to conduct another census at some point between the censuses. Now that means you cannot decide, I don't like the outcome of the 2020 census, so I want to conduct another one in 2021. It also means you can't decide mid-decade, oh, I don't like the way this is working out for my party, so I want to reconduct the census. Those are unconstitutional purposes. Together with any attempts to leave people out of the apportionment count, that would render a mid-decade recensus, if you will, doubly unconstitutional. Remembering the express purposes of the census in the Constitution means recognizing the disruption that would come were we to engage in regular redistrictings in the middle of the decade. Every new census would require a reapportionment of the House of Representatives. Now, obviously, that can't happen after 5 years. It has to wait 6 years. So we'd have 6 years of one apportionment of the House, and then presumably 4 years of another apportionment of the House, at great expense to every state. In addition, with a new census, every redistricting body, from state legislatures down to redistricting commissions, to city councils, to school boards, anybody that has districted elections would have to rewrite their maps in accordance with a new census every time it were conducted. Anyone who's engaged in redistricting can tell you how costly, not just in resources, but in diverted attention, redistricting is every time it occurs. So if we engaged in regular mid-decade recensuses, that would trigger new redistricting each time it occurs at great cost to state and local bodies across the country. Again, if the purpose of the recensus is to exclude people when the Constitution expressly requires an actual enumeration of all persons, that too would render this attempt unconstitutional. Given the primary purposes established in the Constitution both explicitly and derivatively by the Supreme Court, it's important to recognize that any attempt to recensus is about manipulating our democratic processes. It's about manipulating how seats in the House of Representatives are redistributed and about manipulating how redistricting occurs. We already see an attempt to manipulate redistricting wholly apart from the census. But the census itself, if it were to be reconducted, would require every state, not just the few that may be looking at it now, but every state and every locality to redraw their lines in line with the new census data. Now, the further problem with that is that a mid-decade census prior to 2030 would leave no opportunity, as Arturo has explained, to address some of the flaws that we saw in 2020 and the new plans being put in place to ensure that those flaws and others are avoided. I would simply point out that the 2020 census had an undercount of the Latino community that was the highest of all racial ethnic groups at almost 5%. Now, that is almost certainly in large part, because of concerns raised through public discussion of a citizenship question. The Census Bureau has not had the opportunity to recover from that wound to its reputation in 2020 that resulted in that undercount. Were we to conduct a census now or next year, that undercount would almost certainly be even higher. The Census Bureau needs the time to put in place its plans for the 2030 census, and a part of that is trying to ensure that it can restore the trust that previously existed of folks to fill out the census on behalf of their household. A mid-decade recensus, if you will, would not permit that recovery to occur. So in the end, you have to conclude that based on the constitutional legal flaws in any attempt to conduct a census mid-decade, that the cost of actually implementing the census may actually end up being less than the legal defense required as a mid-decade census is challenged in court repeatedly across the country, ultimately with a decision having to be made by the Supreme Court. That decision, I assure you, would be consistent with the Constitution's directive that the census be conducted every 10 years and that it be an actual enumeration of all persons. To talk more about what's involved in preparing each decade, the 10-year course to prepare for the next census, I'll now turn it over to Steve.
I think to put this in context, we want to talk about the total costs of that planning cycle that Arturo referred to, 12 or 13 years. The 2020 census ended up costing $13.7 billion. And nearly half of that money is spent in the last 18 months on an extensive workforce enumerators that go door to door to follow up on the folks that don't self-respond. And I think we've seen a pattern in the last 3 decennial counts since 2000 of where about 2/3 of the country self-responds either by mail, by phone, or the great innovation of the last census, online response for everyone. And we have to follow up on about 1/3 of the households in the country. And a lot of people don't trust the census because they're recent immigrants that come from countries where censuses were used for negative purposes. And a lot of people don't know that the census is actually happening. And that's why there's a paid advertising and awareness campaign, which I led in 2010 and 2000. And its principal purpose is to overcome that mistrust. So where are we today in the funding cycle? In July, both the House and the Senate acted on the Commerce, Justice, Science appropriations, under which the Census Bureau is funded. The House Appropriations Subcommittee approved their version July 16th by a 9-6 vote, but it was not considered by the full committee or the full House. It provided $1.676 billion for the next fiscal year, 2026, which is $294 million above 25 and at the same level that President Trump proposed in his budget. The bill included, though, a pair of legislative provisions similar to language in the FY25 House bill opposed by most census stakeholders. One section, 556, prohibits the use of any funds in the act to be used by the Census Bureau to include, quote, aliens who are unlawfully present in the United States in rendering apportionment determinations for the next decennial. And then section 605, which many census takers also opposed, prohibits any of the funds to be used to enforce involuntary compliance, quote, or to inquire more than twice for voluntary compliance. Well, you need to understand that the census outreach effort includes a postcard that gets mailed to everybody that the census is coming, and then an invitation to answer it online, and boom, we're done. That's 2 contacts. But there are many subsequent mailings to get people to cooperate for that that got us to that 2/3 level on self-response. So most everyone in the census stakeholder community opposes this provision because it would probably end up with maybe a 30 or 40% self-response if we had that limitation. Over in the Senate, the day after the House acted on a 19-10 vote, they provided funding at a lower level, $1.52 billion for the Census Bureau. And that means they're below both 2025 and what the president requested. Now, the good news is they also included report language that stakeholders had requested that will help improve the census operations and help address the undercounts that both Thomas and Arturo talked about in the preceding conversation. In the report language, they request that the Census Bureau take steps to modernize the American Community Survey, which replaces the old census decennial long form, and to report to the committee within 180 days of how those improvements would be taken. They also call out the census tests, which will take place in 2026, and said that they need to be demographically diverse field sites nationwide with a nationally representative sample of households. And the committee urged the Bureau to prioritize, and I think this is an important point in the conversation about a mid-decade census. The Senate report language calls on the Bureau to prioritize and protect funding and contracts necessary to ensure the objectives of the 26 census test are fully realized. In other instances, the Senate report language calls out for the Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis to report back to the committee within 30 days on the status of data sets that had been removed from websites and why those steps were taken. They also defend the use of the advisory committees and ask for a report in 30 days on why both BEA and the Census Bureau terminated those advisory committees back in February. And there's other language in support of research and evaluation reports for the 2030 census, including a detailed report on the estimated budgetary costs for those, the effects of field office closures that are part of the operational plan, and they're requesting that report in 180 days, and encouragement on utilizing libraries and other community partners for census surveys, all census surveys, including the ACS. So we have two numbers, we have two bills. One's got a good number, but some bad attachments to it. And the other's got a little bit lower number, but some very positive developments. So the hope is that in some kind of conference process that would take place normally, we would get a merging of those two bills where we maybe get a good shot at getting the best of both. Now, where are we in the appropriations process? Lawmakers will return after the Labor Day recess. They acknowledge they'll need a short-term CR to keep the government open by October and buy time for Congress to strike an overall fiscal 2026 spending deal. Some conservatives, especially in the House, have expressed backing a full-year CR, which would mostly lock in for another year funding level set back in March of 24 when we went through the same exercise for fiscal 25. Neither of these CR outcomes is good for 2030 planning, because this is the very point in the decade when the funding on that 13.7 billion starts to ramp up. And if you ask the Bureau to flat level their funding back to last fiscal year, they're going to tell you if that is a short-term CR, maybe a month or two, they can probably manage without impacting major operations, including the 2026 tests. But if it's a full year CR, then there are serious consequences to the planning for the 2030 operations. And we don't want to repeat what we had in the 2020 census when funding levels were delayed, frozen, CR levels flatlined, and that caused the Census Bureau to cancel all their field tests and their dress rehearsals, which probably helped lead to some of those undercounts because the Census Bureau couldn't fully test its operations. The Senate Appropriations Committee passed 8 of their funding bills out of committee, and they plan to try to pass the other 4 when they return. There is some chance of a minibus of 2 or 3 bills that might make its way to the House, but not many folks believe that the House would act on those, on that minibus. At the same time, the whole notion of a bipartisan government funding negotiation has been complicated by recent comments from the OMB that they're going to enact rescissions, whatever is passed, and that the process will be less bipartisan, if you can imagine. So at this point in time, the risk of a temporary government shutdown is growing. The Bureau is facing serious headwinds to be able to keep the 2030 planning on track. And as we learned in the run-up to the 2020 national headcount, failing to fully fund preparations for the decennial led to serious cuts in research and testing, which undermined the quality of the count. We must insist to Congress that they not repeat this error, that they keep their eye on the constitutionally mandated 2030 decennial and not let talk of a mid-decade exercise divert resources from that mission. And with that, I'll turn it all over to Terry Ann.
Thank you so much, Steve. And hello, census stakeholders and journalists. The I have been asked to wrap up the remarks portion of this event by talking about the milestones on the road to 2030. Before I do that, let me comment briefly again, because there have been a few questions on the recent calls for a so-called mid-decade, let's put that in quotes, census. Tom and Steve have talked about why the Constitution doesn't envision that. Let me talk a minute about the law. One, Congress authorized a mid-decade census in 1976, but it has never funded one. Two, that census must take place in the year ending in 5 with an April 1st census day. So the window of opportunity for this decade under current law is closed. That law also prohibits the use of a mid-decade census to reapportion seats in Congress or redraw congressional district lines. So in fact, the rationale for a mid-decade census faded when the Census Bureau, at the urging of Congress, by the way, I was there at the time, transitioned from the traditional census long form to the ongoing American Community Survey. In other words, to collect more timely data on community characteristics that lawmakers and others need between the once-a-decade population count. So my conclusion is, if there's going to be another census before 2030, Congress must amend the Census Act and then come up with billions more dollars, and then figure out how the Census Bureau can compress 10 plus years of planning into a few months. So enough said. The bottom line, in my humble opinion, there will not be a census before 2030. So let me pivot to what we expect and hope to see on the road to the constitutionally and statutorily required census in 2030. I will just highlight 5 major milestones for you, and happy to answer any questions if you want more detail. So a couple of my colleagues have talked about the 2026 census test. Regrettably, there has really been radio silence since the new administration took office on the status of planning for 6 field sites, plus a nationally representative self-response only sample, which is supposed to evaluate mailing and messaging strategies. And by the way, that national sample is not envisioned as a content test, meaning to look at questions, but without more information publicly right now, my census antenna are up, and I'm a bit worried about what we might see. Now, the community outreach and promotion for these field test sites should have started this past summer. In the absence of advisory committee meetings, though, and public briefings, as has been the norm in past decades, it's not clear what's been done yet. The Bureau had planned on 1 or more public briefings on the specific focus of each test site for last spring. That didn't happen. The Census Bureau should start recruiting and hiring temporary staff in the field sites soon, but they have not done that yet. And again, we don't have any details about the self-response sample, including the sample size, when we really should have already seen a Federal Register notice allowing for public comments on that proposed activity. Now, second is the local update of census addresses, the LUCA program. So the Census Bureau will start reaching out to tribal, state, and local governments next year to prepare for this first 2030 census operation, and it's the only operation required by law. The good news is that the Census Bureau has taken steps to partner with stakeholders who want to start getting ready for this foundational census activities. It's foundational because it helps make sure the universe for the census is complete before the counting starts. And we expect to see a request for public comments on the scope of the 2030 Census LUCA operation by next spring. Third, the census residence rules. The residence rules govern where to count people who are residents of the United States on Census Day. And we should assume the Census Bureau is reviewing those now, because we expect to see the rules for the 2030 census published in early 2027. That's not that far away. But let me emphasize once more. The residence rules determine where to count people who live here, as opposed to tourists and short-term visitors. Since the Census Bureau is a snapshot of the population on April 1st. The Constitution, as Tom Sines ably explained, determines who should be counted, and that's the whole number of person in each state. And then early laws define where to count people, which is at one's usual place of residence on the census day. Fourth, the census questions. Now, technically, this is called census content, but this is another big milestone to watch because, as most of you know, the Census Bureau must submit the topics it will cover in the census, which, by the way, includes the ongoing American Community Survey I mentioned earlier, must submit the topics to Congress by April 1st, 2027. That's 18 months from now. And that means the Bureau should be well along the path of asking federal agencies to justify with statutory citations the need for block level data in the case of the once a decade count, and the census tract level data in the case of the ACS. The Census Bureau will then research those requests before committing, to collect the data, because federal law requires the Bureau both to reduce the burden of response on the public, that's the Paperwork Reduction Act, and to rely on administrative records when feasible, both to reduce the burden and costs. Of course, unsaid and unknown at this point, and especially in light of the lack of transparency that my colleagues have already highlighted, is whether the administration has asked the Census Bureau to add a question on citizenship or immigration status. But the clock is ticking on the content determination, so we should be keeping an eye on this. And then finally, and very quickly, the 2028 census dress rehearsal. We should expect an announcement about those sites, and usually there is more than one site, but that is funding dependent, as we learned in the last decade. We should expect that announcement in 2027 and in the first half of that year for the 2028 dress rehearsal. Now, I know the Census Bureau keeps talking about doing two major field tests, but in fact, the 2028 dress rehearsal isn't really a test, it's really a dry run of the operational plan. So I'll just conclude by urging Congress and other stakeholders not to get distracted by these calls for a new census before the one the law and the Constitution requires in 2030. Because, as I explained earlier, that proposal is neither feasible nor wise. I know some public officials are still complaining about the accuracy of the 2020 census, but I hope they'll stop looking in the rearview mirror and help the Census Bureau to figure out how to improve the accuracy of the 2030 count. We need to keep our eyes on the nation's prize, and that's a successful 2030 census that counts all communities equally well. The Census Bureau needs the next 4 years to get that done, along with staff expertise and the funding ramp up that Steve talked about. So thanks again, and I will turn this back over to Mita for some Q&A time.
Thank you so much to Terry Ann and to all of our panelists. I do want to flag for anyone listening that as I said before, we have some extra experts on hand too that will answer questions should they be relevant. We have Maya Berry from the Arab American Institute. We have Terry Almenis from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We have Caroline Medina from Movement Advancement Project, and Janine Abrams-McLean from Fair Counts, though Janine might have to leave. So just wanted to flag, we do have other people on hand. We just don't have time for everyone. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, in the Q&A box. We'll get to what we can. If you are from the media, we would ask if you could please identify your outlet. So with that said, Terry Ann, I'm going to give this one to you. Do you believe that Trump is delaying nomination of a new Census Bureau director? And I guess maybe that one's harder to answer than the next part, which is, should the next director be sworn in no earlier than April 1st, 2026, so that they are in charge of the delivery of the PL 940171 data due on the 31st of March, 2031? And does 2031 scare you when I say that as a year?
That means I guess I'll be 6 years older. Yes, very scary. First of all, I'm not going to, ascribe any, motives to the president or not. We don't know if he's delaying, but he has not indicated, a nominee for the Census Bureau director. There also is not a confirmed Undersecretary of Commerce yet for Economic Affairs, which oversees the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I will just say it's true that current law provides for a 5-year renewable term of office for the census director. However, a president may, with 60 days notice to Congress, remove a census director before that time. So while one would hope that a census director can serve a full 5-year or perhaps 10-year term to provide for consistency, that might not always happen.
Thank you so much for that. Arturo, I'm going to send one over to you, which is, a successful census depends on trusted voices. I think we can all agree with that. These voices recognize that participating in the census benefits the community and does not harm that community. Will a citizenship question and deportation threats impact the assistance of those trusted voices?
Thank you for that question, Mita. We need to look only at what happened with the 2020 census to understand the impact that even just the discussion of adding a citizenship question has on the public's trust in the Census Bureau and that the data they provide is safe and confidential. Even though there was no citizenship question on the 2020 questionnaire, the debate around it raised significant doubts that we saw a significant decline in response rates among immigrant households and households with immigrant and mixed status families. This contributed to a dramatic national undercount of the US population. So continuing this conversation into 2030 will only solidify that wound in the Census Bureau's reputation that Thomas referred to and undermine its ability to be a credible agency to the public. The public trust and the public's participation is the most significant challenge that we have in getting a complete and accurate census. Undermining that undermines the census.
Thank you for that answer, Arturo. Thomas, you answered a question from Mike Schneider in the Q&A box, which I think is actually something that is on many people's minds. So Mike asked us about Governor Ron DeSantis's calls for using a post-enumeration survey for an adjustment of Florida's census count to address what he calls a ripoff of a congressional seat. I would love to ask you to tell your answer verbally for those people who are not reading the chat, and also offer the opportunity for others on this panel to respond to that as well.
Certainly, my response is that the PES is not an actual enumeration, and the Constitution requires an actual enumeration, at least for the apportionment of the House of Representatives. So while you may use other data for other purposes, clearly under the Constitution, you can't reassign congressional seats, as DeSantis would apparently like, based on something that is not an actual enumeration. The actual enumeration language leads to the census, leads to actually attempting to count every person. And that's the only thing that can legitimately be used for reapportionment. Now, there have been debates about what you can do to adjust that data, but clearly the PES is not an actual enumeration. So at least for apportionment purposes, that would appear to be completely out of bounds under the Constitution.
Terry Ann, I've seen you go off mute.
Yes, I just wanted to add quickly, having been involved while I was in Congress in a number of the debates over the use of the post-enumeration survey. Tom is absolutely right. I just want to add that the law also prohibits the use of sampling to produce or to compile the census counts used for apportionment at this point. And in fact, the Supreme Court, while not yet ruling on the use of a post-enumeration survey to correct or adjust the raw census counts for apportionment, has ruled definitively that the law prohibits that at this point. So the law would need to be amended if that were the case.
All right, thanks
So,
very much, Terry. Oh, yes, go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was another interesting question that I think Terry Ann was going to answer in the Q&A.
The admin recs one? Yes, excellent. That's where I was
That's the
taking
one
us.
about administrative records. So and the question was, from a great questioner, if this is an administrative records census, would that pass muster? And it's an interesting question because, again, the key is whether that's an actual enumeration. It's conceivable that an actual enumeration doesn't require going door to door and talking to each household. It certainly doesn't require talking to each person. So the question in my mind really depends on how comprehensive the administrative records are, right? So theoretically, if you had comprehensive administrative records, you could conduct an actual enumeration using those records. I don't think that we're anywhere close to having comprehensive administrative records that would permit you to argue that you can conduct an actual enumeration through looking only at records.
Terry Ann, anything to add to that?
Well, I would just say, because as Tom indicated, this is still wide open for debate. And regrettably, to my way of thinking, Congress really should be diving into these issues, in order to look at these possibilities for the future. In fact, I think it's likely that at this point, if challenged, the Supreme Court would accept an effort to give everyone a chance to respond directly through self-response, perhaps one, maybe two knocks on the door, but would allow then using administrative records and, as it already does, and other methods such as asking a neighbor, called a proxy response, or a landlord and so forth, in order to try to make the count as inclusive as possible.
Thank you. We have a question from Sam Kelly of the Houston Chronicle, which is, if any of us have received any indication that the American Community Survey may be used for immigration enforcement, or if it's being conducted any differently than in years past. And this question is being asked because some people in Houston have expressed concerns after receiving the American Community Survey in the mail recently. Sam, thank you so much for the question. I will say we like to call August ACS Awareness Month, so we appreciate you asking that very question. Does anyone want to take that question? I'm happy to. Okay, Steve, go ahead.
To my knowledge, they're still conducting the ACS in the same manner that they always have. And occasionally, because it's a long questionnaire, people raise questions about its legitimacy and if they're required to respond to it. That's been historic. But I don't know of any effort to use it for any other purpose than its statutorily mandated purpose. But I'll segue to what Arturo talked about. I oversaw the advertising campaign, and there were two purposes of the advertising campaign. One was to raise awareness, and the other one was to get the public's trust. And as Arturo knows very well, we sat through long sessions together reviewing every execution, how to ensure that people trusted the Census Bureau, and they're facing more headwinds than ever. If you just go back to the Doge era and all the aggregation of data sets, will my information be shared anywhere else? Well, gosh, the public is aware of what Doge was doing and maybe continuing to do on that front. And having ICE agents on the street in the middle of the census would be just impossible for someone in my position. if you go back to 2020, they spent $675 million on advertising in 47 languages on every channel possible, print, broadcast, and they still couldn't overcome the challenges and the mistrust that the citizenship question and then, of course, the COVID overcome. So that, all the administration is doing is making the decennial count more expensive with these efforts.
Arturo, anything to add to that?
Thank you, Mita. What I would also add is that data collected by the Census Bureau is protected by Title 13 of the U.S. Code. Title 13 requires that all personal information received by the Census Bureau be maintained confidential. And there are severe penalties that any Census Bureau employee is subject to for violating any of the confidentiality standards in Title 13.
Thank you, Arturo. And
If
I believe, oh, Tom, yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add, let's also be clear. You can't engage in immigration enforcement based on an answer to a citizenship question. So although Donald Trump may not understand this, those who understand the law recognize that the majority of non-citizens in this country have every legal right to be here. Most of them are lawful permanent residents. They would answer a citizenship question with a no. So you really can't use that data to engage in anything that would approximate rational immigration enforcement. I know the answer is he doesn't engage in rational, and I agree with that. But it doesn't give you much of a lead if you only have an answer to a citizenship question that does appear on the ACS, of course.
Thank you for that, Tom. And I will just add one point. So I guess this question was a popular one, which is just that I believe we would all be aware if the Title 13 protections were being breached, and that is not something any of us have heard of at this point. Maya Berry, I'm actually going to bring you on camera because there is a question about the MENA category and whether or not we believe that will be impacted, and maybe speak a bit about the implementation of the new race and ethnicity standards as part of your answer would be helpful.
Thank you, Mita, and my other colleagues. I think the short answer to the question is yes. And for the reasons, frankly, that my colleague Arturo raised earlier, which is that the collection of accurate data about folks requires a public trust in the process of collecting the data. So the importance of using the updated race and ethnicity standards that are being implemented, announced in 2024. Next month, actually, September 28th, is the deadline by which the agencies are supposed to submit their action plans for the implementation of the new race and ethnicity standards. And to be clear, that they were significant and important. The Bureau had worked for a long time on determining how to improve and modernize our data collection. So there are three principal requirements in those standards. The first was a combined race and ethnicity question. The second was a new MENA, Middle East and North African category. And the third was the collection of detailed race and ethnicity standards as a default. So the importance of the disaggregate data is critical. So I think that the way that the collection will be impacted for this new category is sort of critical. The importance of getting everything else right going into this time is certainly there, but also the fact that there'll be a new category in place, and we really do need to lean into and focus on the public trust issue.
Thank you so much, Maya. I will note there was a question about improving outreach around the census. And Lunita, I see your question, and I see Tariana is responding, and I do want to say that in light of what we've learned from Arturo, for instance, today, and everyone else in terms of the need for trusted messengers, that we will need, unfortunately, to rely on all of our communities even more than ever to have the trusted messengers to conduct the appropriate outreach to all communities. And I believe, Tariana, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the Census Bureau was thinking about an open question portion, like where people might want to type in more about themselves for the 2030 census. Do you recall that?
In terms of race and ethnicity?
Or just, I believe it was something like if they want to leave a message for future descendants.
Oh, yes. Well, that's something that is something that they had raised during the research phase, as a way, as you said, to sort of bond with the American public. This is, I think it was Arturo said, this is our largest civic mobilization, and the only one that involves every person in the United States, every household, and so forth. Whether they're going to do that is really unknown because, again, we don't have any details about the 2026 census test yet.
Thank you for that. Terry Ann, while I have you, I'm going to ask you one last question. This is from Rich Toby, which someone's been doing their homework, which is referring to the Census Bureau's baseline plan to use satellites instead of quote unquote door knockers to confirm residential addresses. And Rich is asking the question about, is there a concern about this, given that there might be changes in how residences are used or buildings are used, especially post-COVID? Do others have that concern? And, should there be, and will there be a collective response on that?
Yeah, I think there is concern that the Census Bureau apparently is not, according to its baseline operational plan, will not do much, if any, of what's called an address canvass operation in the year preceding the census. It believes that by updating the census address list throughout the decade, combined with, and I talked about this, the statutorily required local update of census addresses operation, that it can make sure that the address list is up to date. It also, by the way, gets 4 times a year updated address information from the Postal Service and so forth. But we can use this as an opportunity, Rich, to plug participation, albeit it's voluntary, in the LUCA operation. Localities should start to get ready now to compare their data, and that would include conversions and those new units that are behind homes now. I know they're called ADUs, but I forget what that stands for, and so forth, to help the Census Bureau make sure, in the absence of an address 100% or even 30% address canvass as they did in 2020, to make sure the census address list is inclusive.
Thank you, Terry Ann. I think we can't deny that we should always use new technologies whenever possible, but also make sure that we are supplementing them and making sure they're doing what they should be doing. So, absolutely, we can't get rid of the importance of local knowledge. And thank you for putting the LUCA resource guide in the chat. We have 2 minutes left. And we have an intense question about the deployment of AI, which I'm not sure we can answer in 2 minutes, but I will give people a chance to try, and after that, give everyone 30 seconds to wrap up. All right, people are not taking up on the AI question. I will say that the answer to that would be the answer that I just wrapped up with on satellite imagery. We should look at all technologies and see if there are ways to improve response and accuracy, but we should be careful as we deploy them and always make sure that we are ensuring that whatever we're doing is for a fair and accurate count. Who knows if using AI could be useful in making sure we're developing language resources to make sure we have hyper-local outreach to communities, but that would need to be tested. So with that, let's give everyone 30 seconds to say something that they think we should be keeping our eyes on that Census Prize for as we get to 2030. So Terry Ann, since that was your phrase, can you start us off?
Yeah, well, again, thank you, Mita. I am just going to emphasize that we shouldn't get distracted right now. There is so much work to do to get to 2030. I think there needs to be more congressional oversight, and I think it needs to be based on common sense and be well informed. And we'll get there if we all move in the same direction together.
All right. Thomas, I'm going to you because you're next on my screen.
I want to emphasize that the 2030 census is an incredibly important census because it follows the 2020 census when there was such a decrease in trust of the Census Bureau. The 2030 census is the opportunity to restore us to a sense of trust universally in the Census Bureau, in the data that it gathers, in the protection of the data that it gathers. We need to be concentrating on ensuring that 2030 does that, that we are able to fix the damage, to restore the reputation, to ensure the census is a viable project throughout our continuing history. And we can't do that if we're distracted by further debate about excluding people, by debate about conducting another census for purely political reasons and the like. We need to focus on preparing to restore the reputation.
Steve.
Yeah, I like what Thomas just said a lot. I'm going to just piggyback on it. And what he and Arturo reminded me about Title 13, which I'm still subject to, even though I haven't worked for the Census Bureau for quite a long while, the $250,000 fine or 5 years imprisonment or both if I release personal information on anybody. We need to spend the next 4 years trying to establish trust, because we can't count on an advertising campaign at the last minute to erase what 4 years have undermined. And I think that will also help us keep the eye on the prize of 2030.
Thank you. And Arturo, giving you the last word here.
Thank you, Mita. One of the issues we didn't discuss today, other than the need for appropriations, so that the Census Bureau has the resources to carry out its job, is also whether the Census Bureau has the human capital it needs to carry out its job. We know that a number of career employees left the Census Bureau at the beginning of this administration. Some were encouraged to do so. So there has been a lessening of the capacity and the experience and the institutional knowledge. So one of the things we need to do as well as a network of stakeholders in the census is to support the career employees at the Census Bureau as they proceed with the plans that they have. I have every reason to believe that they want to carry out a successful 2030 census, and we need to make sure they can do so unobstructed and to comply with the Constitution.
Thank you, Arturo. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and people that were on hand to answer questions. Thank you all for attending. We'll be sending follow-up resources, including 12 facts you need to know about the census. So thank you once again for all of your participation, and we look forward to working together to ensure a fair and accurate 2030 census. Thank you.